Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death claimed 25 million lives across Europe, wiping out up to 80% of the population in some cities. The plague was swift and merciless, but for those who survived, life continued in a radically transformed world. Here's what happened after the Black Death devastated Europe. Hey, quick thing before we start. If you actually listen to these regularly, hit like or subscribe. I always wonder where everyone's at, so comment your city and what time it is. Weird to think some of you are having breakfast in London while I'm recording this at night here in the States. Alright, let's head back to Europe in the aftermath of the Black Death. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. But first, get comfortable. Seriously. Adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket, because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. Your eyes open to darkness. The straw mattress beneath you is damp from the night's moisture that seeps through the walls of your small home. For a moment, everything feels normal. That familiar, scratchy texture against your skin, the smoky smell from last night's fire, the distant sound of a rooster. Then it hits you. The silence. No voices in the street. No clanging of the blacksmith's hammer. No children laughing or crying. Just nothing. You're probably wondering, wait, how unusual would this really be? Well, imagine your neighborhood completely empty except for maybe every fifth house. That's what we're talking about here. You rise and step onto the packed dirt floor, cold against your bare feet. Not like your warm carpet or wood floors today. Medieval floors were usually just compressed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that wouldn't be changed for months. Yeah, not exactly the pinnacle of hygiene, which didn't help with the whole plague situation. I spent way too long researching medieval sleeping arrangements for this. Turns out most people slept on simple straw mattresses, often with their whole family and even animals nearby for warmth. Privacy? Not a concept they were familiar with, and these weren't memory foam mattresses. Just sacks stuffed with whatever was available. Straw, hay, sometimes wool if you were lucky. As you step outside, the morning sun illuminates a village transformed. The blood-red sunrise feels appropriate somehow. Down the lane where the baker's shop once filled the air with the smell of fresh bread, the door hangs open. No one has been there for weeks. The baker and his entire family gone. In your head, you're thinking, is anyone even left? The rational part of your brain knows there must be others, but the emotional part feels utterly alone in this moment. You make your way to the village centre. Before the plague, this would have been bustling with activity. Merchants setting up for the day, villagers drawing water from the well, church bells calling people to morning prayer. Now, the well sits untouched, the church door closed. The silence is broken only by the occasional bird or the wind rustling through empty market stalls. "Hello," you call out, your voice sounding foreign even to yourself. "Is anyone there?" There's a shuffle from a nearby house, and an old woman appears, her face gaunt and suspicious. She's carrying a small bundle of herbs, rosemary, thyme, lavender, clutched tightly to her nose. "Stay back," she says, eyeing you cautiously. "You got the sickness?" The sickness. That's what many called it. Others called it the Great Mortality, the Pestilence, or the Great Plague. The term Black Death wasn't actually used until centuries later. "No," you reply, "my family," but you can't finish the sentence. She nods, understanding without words. Her bundle of herbs is what people believed would protect them from bad air, the miasma theory that disease spread through foul smells. So they carried sweet-smelling herbs, or flowers, to counteract it. Completely useless against the actual cause, bacteria carried by fleas on rats, but they didn't know that. "The priest is collecting the dead," she says flatly. "They're digging a pit outside the village, a mass grave." The normal burial customs had broken down completely. One Florentine chronicler wrote about how burial shrouds shot up to 10 times their normal price. And even then, there weren't enough people to dig individual graves. Bodies were piled in great pits, often with little or no ceremony. You follow the path she indicates, and over the rise you see them, a small group of figures, some digging, others dragging wrapped bodies. The smell hits you before you get close, that unmistakable sweet rot of decomposition. Stay with me here, because this is where it gets weird. The person in charge of this grim work isn't the priest as you'd expect, but a local butcher. The priest died 2 weeks ago. The butcher, with his experience handling dead flesh, has become the default undertaker. "We need hands," he calls when he sees you. Not hello or good morning, just a demand for labor. In a world where perhaps 2/3 of your community has vanished, every surviving pair of hands is precious. Picture this. By mid-1349, in places like Florence, Italy, so many people had died that the survivors couldn't keep up with the burial needs. They'd dump bodies in large trenches, layer them with a thin covering of soil, add another layer of bodies, more soil, and so on. Some of these mass graves have been discovered centuries later during construction projects, revealing the grim efficiency of plague-time burial practices. The next few hours blur as you help move the dead. These are people you knew, the miller's wife, the cooper's son, an entire family from the edge of the village. Their bodies are bloated and discoloured, many with the telltale black swellings in the armpits or groin that gave the plague one of its names, the pestilential buboes. Or last week, the butcher says as you pause to catch your breath, a man from the next village came looking for food, said there wasn't a single living soul left there, everyone dead or fled. Imagine that reality for a second. Entire villages just gone. Archaeological evidence has confirmed this happened. We've found abandoned medieval villages where excavations suggest sudden abandonment during the plague years. By midday, your stomach is growling. You realise you haven't eaten since yesterday. With the baker dead, where will bread come from? With so many farmers dead, who will harvest the crops? This is where the first major economic shift began. Food prices skyrocketed immediately after the plague hit a region. According to that Florentine chronicler I mentioned, the food suitable for the sick, cakes and sugar, reached outrageous prices. Chicken and other poultry were unbelievably expensive. You make your way to what once was the marketplace, hoping to find someone selling something, anything edible. There's a single vendor there, an old man with a cart containing a few withered vegetables and a small sack of grain. Around him, a handful of survivors argue over the prices. 6 pennies for a loaf? A woman shouts. That's robbery. Take it or starve, the vendor replies coldly. There's no one left to work the fields. He's not wrong. Farms lay abandoned, crops rotting in the ground. Farmers had died or fled, leaving the fields untended. Domestic animals wandered freely with no one to care for them. In some places, sheep and cattle died in the fields because there was no one to herd them. Okay, picture this. You're standing there watching people argue over the last scraps of food when suddenly the church bell rings. Everyone freezes. This isn't the normal call to prayer. It's erratic, desperate. You all rush toward the church where a lone survivor is pulling frantically on the bell rope. Riders, he shouts, coming from the east. Fear ripples through the small gathering. Riders could mean many things, none of them good. Bandits taking advantage of weakened villages. Officials, coming to collect taxes despite the devastation. Or worse, people fleeing from another plague outbreak, potentially bringing the disease back to your village. The small crowd debates what to do. Some want to hide, others to stand their ground. In your head, you're screaming, "This is how I die, either by bandits or by plague." But before a decision can be made, the riders appear at the village edge. It's the Lord's son returned from a nearby town with several armed men and a wagon of supplies. His father, the local lord, died of the plague months ago. "I've brought grain," he announces, his voice carrying across the square, "and I need workers for the fields. I'll pay double the usual wage." This moment right here, this is history pivoting. See, before the Black Death, peasants were essentially bound to the land, working for whatever the Lord decided to give them, which wasn't much. But with so many dead, the surviving workers suddenly had leverage. Labour shortages meant that workers could demand higher wages and better conditions. The young lord continues, "I need 10 strong people to prepare the fields for planting, 10 pennies a day each." A murmur runs through the crowd. 10 pennies is an unheard of wage. Before the plague, you might have earned 2 pennies for a full day of backbreaking labour. "And what of our own lands?" someone calls out. "We have fields too, if we could get seed." The Lord hesitates, calculating. "Work my fields first, and I'll ensure you have seed for your own." There's a collective hesitation. The old order would have demanded immediate obedience, but the world has changed. Finally, a few step forward, agreeing to the terms. Others hold back, suspicious of promises. And this negotiation, this wasn't something that would have happened before. The massive death toll had disrupted the entire social hierarchy. As one chronicler observed after the plague, once the plague had finished, anybody who could get a hold of whatsoever kind of cloth or found the raw materials to make it became rich. Similarly, survivors inherited goods and wealth from their deceased family members. A person who previously had nothing could suddenly find themselves quite rich. You spend the afternoon helping distribute grain from the Lord's wagon. As the sun begins to set, you return to your empty home. The silence still unnerves you, but there's something else now, a strange sense of possibility. What was once your parents' home is now yours. The tools your father crafted are now yours to use or sell. The small plot of land, while not much, is still more than you ever expected to own. As you light a small fire in the hearth, you consider the day. 24 hours ago, you were overwhelmed by grief and shock. Now there's still grief that won't fade for years, maybe never, but there's also something unexpected, opportunity. Because here's the twist. While the Black Death was unquestionably one of the worst disasters in human history, killing millions and leaving survivors traumatized, it also accidentally created opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Land became available. Wages increased. Social mobility became possible in a way it hadn't been before. This isn't to say things were suddenly great. They weren't. The psychological toll was immense. Petrarch, an Italian poet who lived through the plague, wrote to his brother, "I would, my brother, that I had never been born, or at least had died before these times." He doubted that people of the future, that's us, could possibly understand their suffering. You lie back on your straw mattress, so different from your comfortable bed today. The emptiness of the house presses in on you. Before the plague, you would have been crowded in with parents, siblings, maybe grandparents or other relatives. Now it's just you. As you drift towards sleep, you wonder what tomorrow will bring in this new, emptier world. Will more survivors emerge from hiding? Will the crops be planted in time? Will the plague return? Unlike your peaceful bedroom tonight, with its security and comfort, a medieval survivor of the Black Death would fall asleep each night with profound uncertainty about the future. Yet despite that uncertainty, life would continue, and as we'll see tomorrow, the social fabric of Europe wouldn't just recover, it would transform completely. The grief and horror of mass death would gradually give way to something unexpected, a social revolution that would help pave the way for the modern world. But that's a story for another part of our journey. The second morning after the plague feels different. There's a strange energy in the air. Not hope exactly, but something shifting. You step outside to see a few more people in the village square than yesterday. Some faces you recognize, others are strangers who've wandered in from neighboring settlements where they were the only survivors. The Lord's Son is organizing workers for the fields, still offering those unheard-of wages. But today, something unexpected is happening. A well-dressed man you've never seen before is arguing with him, loudly. "This is my land now," the stranger insists, waving a piece of parchment. "My cousin died with no heirs. I have the legal right." The Lord's Son looks ready to draw his sword. "Your cousin was my father's tenant. This land belongs to my family." And here we see another weird side effect of the plague. Property disputes were absolutely everywhere. When people died without clear heirs, distant relatives showed up making claims. Court records from the years after the plague are packed with inheritance cases. Imagine a family tree being pruned so severely that branches that never expected to inherit anything suddenly had legal claims. A crowd gathers to watch the argument. Next to you, an old farmer spits on the ground. Let them fight over it. Meanwhile, who plants the crops? We'll all starve by winter. He's not wrong. While the nobility and emerging merchant class fought over who owned what, practical matters, like food production, hung in the balance. You can inherit all the land in England, but if nobody's growing food, what good is it? "You worked for the old lord, right?" asks a woman beside you, a child clutching her skirt. "Will you work the fields again?" You hesitate. Before the plague, you'd have had no choice. But now there are options. 10 pennies is good wage, you say, testing the waters. "The tanner in the next village is offering 12, she replies casually, "for anyone who can help him process hides. He lost both his apprentices." Okay, freeze this moment right here. This conversation, this casual mention of shopping around for better wages, this was revolutionary. Before the plague, most peasants were tied to the land through serfdom or other obligations. The idea of just picking up and going somewhere for better pay? Unthinkable for most, but the massive labour shortage changed everything. Meanwhile, the Lord and the newcomer are still arguing. The Lord's Son finally shouts, "We'll take this to the King's Court." The stranger laughs. The King's Court. Half the judges are dead, and the other half have fled London. Who's going to hear your case? He's got a point. The legal system, like everything else, had collapsed in many areas. Records from this period show court sessions cancelled, delayed for months or years, or conducted with whoever happened to be available rather than proper officials. You decide to follow the woman with the child, curious about this tanner offering higher wages. As you walk through the village, you notice something odd. Doors standing open on several houses. People are just taking what they need, the woman explains, following your gaze. No one left to claim it. Inside one abandoned home, you glimpse someone filling a sack with cooking pots, tools, clothing. Not stealing exactly, more like redistributing. Who was left to say who owned what? This massive wealth redistribution wasn't just happening with small items. In Florence, one chronicler recalled, once the plague had finished, anybody who could get a hold of whatsoever kind of cloth or found the raw materials to make it became rich. Similarly, survivors inherited goods and wealth from their deceased family members. A person who previously had nothing could suddenly find themselves quite rich. The woman leads you to a crossroads where a small group has gathered around a makeshift market, just a few blankets spread with goods. But these aren't normal market goods. There are silver cups, fine linen, tools, jewelry, things that would have been far beyond your reach before. Where did all this come from, you ask, though you already know. The dead don't need silver, says the man sitting cross-legged behind the display. He's missing 2 fingers and has the rough hands of someone who worked the fields his whole life. Found a whole chest of this stuff in my master's house after everyone there died. Figured I'd trade it for things I can actually use. You reach out to touch a silver goblet, then hesitate. It feels wrong somehow, profiting from so much death. The peasant notices your hesitation. "Oh, look," he says flatly, "my whole family's gone. Took them all in 3 days. You think I wanted this cup instead? But here we are. Might as well make use of what's left." I've studied accounts from plague survivors, and this practical approach was common. Not because people were heartless, but because the sheer scale of death made prolonged mourning almost impossible. Society had to continue functioning. You trade a small knife you've carried for years for a wool blanket that would have cost you a month's wages before. As you fold it, the woman touches your arm. "The tanner's this way," she says, nodding down a path, "if you're interested." The tan yard sits at the edge of a neighbouring village, the sharp smell of urine, lime and animal hides hitting you long before you see it. Tanning was one of those necessary but deeply unpleasant medieval trades that nobody wanted to live near. The process used urine and animal brains to prepare hides. Yeah, really appetizing, I know. The tanner himself is a burly man with forearms like tree trunks. He looks up from scraping a hide as you approach. "You here to work?" he asks without preamble. "Maybe," you reply cautiously. "Heard you're paying 12 pennies. 15 now," he says. "Lost another worker yesterday, not to the plague. He just took off with some silver he found in an abandoned house, going to try his luck in London." The tanner spits. "Fool, city's got hit worse than anywhere." And he was right about that. Urban centres, with their crowded conditions, suffered death rates sometimes exceeding 50–60% of the population. In contrast, some isolated rural areas lost only a third of their people. Cold comfort, but it meant different recovery patterns. "Never tanned before," you admit. The tanner shrugs. "Can you follow instructions? Not afraid of mess? That's all I need. I can teach the rest." Before you can answer, there's a commotion from the village centre. Bells ringing, shouts. You and the tanner exchange glances and hurry toward the sound. A rider on a lathered horse has arrived, bringing news from the nearest large town. A crowd gathers as he gulps water from a proffered cup. "The bishop's declared all debts to the church forgiven," the messenger announces. "Says it's God's mercy for survivors." Murmurs run through the crowd. Church forgiveness of debts was a big deal. Many peasants were perpetually in debt to religious institutions that owned vast tracts of land. "What of the king's taxes?" someone calls out. The rider laughs, a harsh sound. "King's collectors tried to enter 3 villages. 2 were driven off with pitchforks. The 3rd hasn't been seen since." This was real, by the way. Tax collection broke down completely in many areas. Some collectors were attacked, others simply found ghost towns with no one left to tax. Records show royal revenues plummeted. "And the guilds in town?" asks an older man, likely a craftsman. "Are they taking new members?" Before the plague, craft guilds, organizations controlling trades like baking, metalworking, or weaving, were notoriously exclusive. They limited membership to protect their monopolies and keep prices high. The Weavers Guild is taking anyone who can thread a loom, the messenger replies. Half their members are dead, and they have orders backed up from before the sickness. It's hard to overstate how significant this was. Guilds that once required 7-year apprenticeships and family connections were suddenly desperate for anyone with basic skills. Social mobility that would have been impossible before was now there for the taking. You look back at the tanner, considering his offer. 15 pennies a day is more than you would have earned in 2 weeks of field work before. But the smell, the mess. Tell you what, the tanner says, reading your expression. Try it for 3 days. If you hate it, I'll pay you for the time and no hard feelings. As you hesitate, a woman elbows her way through the crowd, heading straight for the tanner. Master Fuller, she says, I've come about the work. The tanner looks surprised. You? But you're a woman? Yes, she interrupts. And my husband was your best worker before he died. I helped him for years. I know the process as well as any man. Okay, so here's another massive social shift happening. Women entering trades that were previously male-dominated. With labour so scarce, gender barriers started crumbling in certain industries. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough that women found opportunities that would have been unthinkable before. The tanner scratches his chin. Ever actually done the heavy scraping? The lifting? I've given birth to 4 children, she replies dryly. I can handle lifting a hide. A few people in the crowd chuckle. The tanner shrugs. 15 pennies, same as anyone else. 20. She counters. The crowd goes silent. A woman negotiating wages like this? Unheard of. The tanner barks a laugh. 18 and not a penny more. And you train this one too. He jerks a thumb at you. Done, she says without hesitation. And just like that, you've become an apprentice tanner with a woman as your teacher, being paid more than skilled craftsmen made before the plague. The old world truly was gone. As the crowd disperses, the messenger continues sharing news. Towns are offering citizenship to any skilled worker who will settle there. Landlords are reducing rents to keep tenants. Merchants who once dealt only in luxury goods for the wealthy are now selling to anyone with coin. You follow your new mentor back to the tannery, trying to ignore the smell that will soon become your daily reality. I'm Agnes, she says over her shoulder. Why tanning, you ask? You could probably do something less foul. Agnes slows to walk beside you. My husband didn't die of the plague, she says quietly. 2 years ago, a cart crushed him, left me with 4 children and no income, begged the tanner to let me work. He refused, said it wasn't woman's work. I took in washing instead, barely keeping us fed. She smiles grimly. And now he needs me more than I need him. Funny how things change. This reveals another side of the post-plague economy. People who had been marginalized before, women, lower-class workers, even the disabled in some cases, suddenly found their skills valued, not out of charity or social progress, but out of sheer necessity. At the tannery, Agnes doesn't waste time. She throws you a stained apron and points to a pile of raw hides. First step, scrape off all the flesh and fat, she demonstrates with a curved knife. Too much left on, the hide rots. Too much taken off, the leather's weak. The work is disgusting. Within an hour, you're covered in animal bits. Your arms ache, and the smell has penetrated everything. But there's something strangely satisfying about the transformation, taking a raw, bloody hide and beginning its conversion into something useful. By midday, your stomach is growling despite the stench. Agnes calls a break, and you both rinse your hands in a bucket before sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese that the tanner provides. He never fed workers before, Agnes comments, seeing your surprise. Food costs are up threefold, and he knows we could walk away and find work elsewhere by sunset. This was part of the new reality. Employers had to offer not just higher wages, but better conditions to attract and keep workers. Some Italian cities even passed laws limiting how luxuriously workers could be treated, trying to prevent employer competition from driving up costs too much. "Where are you sleeping?" Agnes asks as you eat. You realize you haven't thought about it. Your family home is in the next village over. Walking back and forth each day would be possible but tiring. He has a shed out back. Agnes nods toward a small structure. 2 workers used to share it. Now it's empty, not much, but it's shelter. After lunch, she shows you the next steps in the process, soaking the scraped hides in a mixture of water, lime, and urine. Yes, actual human urine collected in vats. Medieval tanning was not for the squeamish. "Everyone contributes," Agnes says with a straight face, pointing to a bucket in the corner of the shed. By evening, your body aches from unfamiliar labor, and you reek so badly you doubt you'll ever smell normal again. But as the tanner counts out your first day's wages, 18 small silver coins that glint in the fading light, you feel something unexpected: independence. Before the plague, your path would have been set. You'd have worked the same fields as your parents and grandparents, handed most of your harvest to the Lord, and lived or starved by forces beyond your control. Now, with those coins heavy in your palm, you have choices. You think of the silver goblet at the makeshift market. With a week's wages, you could buy such treasures for yourself. But then what? You can't eat silver. Can't warm yourself with it. Instead, you walk back to the market as dusk falls and trade one of your precious coins for a thick candle, a small loaf of bread, and a piece of hard cheese. Practical things, survival things. In your borrowed shed that night, by candlelight, you eat better than you would have on a normal day before the plague. Tomorrow, you'll earn more coins, maybe save them, maybe trade for tools or clothes. The future is uncertain, but for perhaps the first time, it feels like your choice to make. As you drift towards sleep on a pile of straw that doesn't feel so different from your mattress back home, you realize something. In this strange new world where death has taken so much, it has also perversely given something back, a measure of freedom. Unlike your comfortable bedroom tonight with its security and predictability, medieval survivors like you faced a world where all the old rules had suddenly changed. Terrifying, yes, but also filled with possibilities that would have been unimaginable just months before. And as the social fabric continued to unravel and re-knit itself in the coming months, those possibilities would only multiply, bringing both opportunity and conflict as Europe stumbled toward a new normal in the plague's devastating wake. 3 months into your new life as a tanner's apprentice, and the stink doesn't even bother you anymore. Agnes says that's how she knows you've become one of them. When you stop noticing the smell, everyone else still gives you a wide berth when you walk through the village, though. "It's better than perfume these days," Agnes jokes as you both scrape hides under the summer sun. "Nobody wants to get close enough to give you the plague." She's not entirely wrong. People have developed strange ideas about how the disease spreads. Some believe it travels through bad smells, the miasma theory, while others are convinced it's carried in looks or breath. The stench of the tannery might be repulsive, but at least it keeps people at a distance. The tannery has been busy. With so many people dead, there are more cattle per survivor, which means more hides to process. Your hands have grown calloused, your arms stronger, and your coin purse heavier. Master Fuller, calls a voice from the road. A well-dressed man on horseback, clearly a merchant of some kind, approaches with a handkerchief held to his nose. The tanner straightens, wiping his hands on his apron. I need 50 good leather hides by month's end for saddles and harnesses. The king's requisitioned horses for his French campaign, and there's good money for those who can outfit them. 50? The tanner scratches his chin. That's a tall order. Got just 4 workers now. The merchant eyes you and Agnes. 4? You're counting the woman? Agnes straightens, knife in hand. I finished more hides last week than the 2 men combined. I've read accounts where women who stepped into traditionally male roles during the labour shortage faced exactly this kind of scepticism, but the economic reality eventually forced even the most traditional minds to adapt. The merchant looks doubtful, but turns back to Master Fuller. 50 hides, 6 shillings each. The tanner nearly chokes. 6? The price was 4 before the death. Take it or leave it. Every tanner for 20 miles is getting the same offer. After the merchant leaves, Master Fuller calls everyone together. 4 of you now. You, Agnes, a teenage boy who started last month, and a grey-haired man who'd been a farmer until his entire family died. We can do 50 hides in a month, the tanner says, but we'll need to work from sunrise to sunset. I'll pay you each 25 pennies a day. Agnes crosses her arms. 30. 28, he counters immediately. And Sundays off, adds the older man, for church. The tanner sighs. Fine, 28 pennies and Sundays free, but we start at dawn tomorrow. Once he walks away, Agnes nudges you. Before the plague, he'd have laughed at us for even suggesting higher wages. Now he bargains like we're equals. This was happening everywhere. A Suffolk landowner complained in his journal that workers become so rebellious that the master fears his servant more than the servant his master. Can you imagine how radical that shift must have felt to people who had lived their entire lives in a rigid hierarchy? By late summer of 1350, about 3 years after the plague first hit Europe, something remarkable was happening across the countryside. Peasants weren't just earning more, they were living better. You see it in your own life. With your wages, you've moved out of the shed into a small but solid cottage whose previous owners all died. You've bought a real bed with a stuffed mattress instead of sleeping on straw. Your meals include meat several times a week, something unheard of for common folk before. On your next free Sunday, you walk to the village church. The building seems too large now for the smaller congregation. The new priest, the 3rd since the plague, the first 2 having died, is a young man with a nervous manner. He was rushed through his training to fill the desperate shortage of clergy. Brothers and sisters, he begins, his voice cracking slightly. Let us pray for those still suffering from God's great punishment. An old woman near the front stands up. If it's God's punishment, why did he take my innocent grandchildren and not sinners like the tax collector or the Lord's bailiff? They survived without a mark. The priest stammers, God's ways are mysterious. Mysterious, another voice calls out. Was it mysterious how the Jews poisoned the wells to spread the disease? This awful rumour had spread across Europe, leading to horrific persecution of Jewish communities. In some places, entire Jewish populations were murdered by mobs looking for someone to blame. There is no evidence of well poisoning, the priest says, with surprising firmness. The Pope himself has said as much. Then why did the plague spread along trade routes? Someone else demands. It followed where people travelled. This observation was actually quite astute. The disease did indeed follow human movement patterns, though not because of deliberate poisoning, but because the rats and fleas carrying the bacteria travelled with human cargo. After the service, people linger in small groups outside the church. You overhear snippets of conversation. The miller's charging triple what he did before. Can't get decent cloth anymore. All the best weavers died. My cousin's gone to London, says a craftsman can name his price there. The world has turned upside down. Things that were once cheap are now expensive. Jobs that were once scorned are now sought after. People who once had no options now have choices. You spot Agnes talking with several women and join their circle. Telling him I won't marry unless I can keep my job at the tannery, Agnes is saying, and my own wages. And what did he say to that? Asks a younger woman, eyes wide. He agreed, Agnes laughs. Can you imagine? Before the death, he'd have just found another woman. Now, she shrugs. Men need wives more than wives need husbands these days. It wasn't just economic power shifting. Social relationships were changing too. With so many widows and widowers, new marriages were forming with different expectations. Women who had proven they could support themselves weren't so quick to give up that independence. As you walk back from church, you pass the manor house where the Lord's son, now the Lord himself since his father's death was confirmed, is overseeing renovations. The windows are being enlarged, glass is being installed, even the nobility is living differently now. A group of labourers sitting in the shade, taking a break from the construction, wave you over. "Tanner," one calls out. "Come tell Martin here what you're earning these days." You hesitate, then share your daily wage. The workers whistle appreciatively. "See," the first man says to his companion, "and he's just an apprentice. I told you we should ask for more." "The Lord will never agree," Martin replies. "Then we all walk off the job," shrugs the first man. "See how fast his fancy windows get finished then." This collective bargaining power was unprecedented. Before, a lord might have had troublemakers flogged or worse. Now, workers were organizing in ways that would eventually lead to the famous uprisings, like the 1381 Peasants' Revolt. The following week brings something new to your life. A visitor from a large town 20 miles away. "Master Fuller," the visitor addresses the tanner. "I represent the Tanners' Guild of St. Alban. We've heard of your operation here." The tanner frowns. "What of it? You're producing leather without guild oversight, without standardized quality." "Been tanning 30 years, Master Fuller spits. "My leather's better than half your guild's." "Nevertheless," the visitor continues, "the guild requires all tanners to be members, or to cease operation." Agnes whispers to you, "Before the plague, they'd have shut him down without a second thought. Guilds controlled everything." Master Fuller laughs. "And if I tell you to go back to your guild and kiss my arse?" The visitor's face reddens. "The guild has authority. Half your guild is dead," the tanner interrupts, "and I hear the rest can't keep up with demand. You need me more than I need you." The visitor changes tactics. "Join the guild and we'll ensure no one undercuts your prices. We set the rates for all members." "And the membership fee?" "Or normally £5, the visitor says, "but given the circumstances, we could reduce it to 2. Master Fuller considers this. £1, and I keep my current workers without them needing guild approval. They haggle a while longer before reaching an agreement." After the visitor leaves, you ask, "Why join at all? You said yourself they need you more than you need them." "For now," the tanner nods, "but times change. Better to have a say in the guild than fight it forever. Besides," he grins, "now we can charge guild prices." By autumn of 1350, another change becomes apparent. People are obsessed with avoiding disease. New daily rituals have emerged that would have seemed strange before the plague. You see it when trading in the village market. People hold fragrant herbs to their noses while shopping. They avoid touching hands when exchanging coins. Many wear small pouches of sweet-smelling herbs around their necks. Plague amulets, they're called. It keeps away the bad air, explains a woman selling these pouches. Rosemary, mint, lavender, and wormwood. Wear it at all times. You've noticed Agnes wearing one, though she seems embarrassed when you point it out. Can't hurt, she mutters. My neighbour swears they work. Her whole street died except for those with the herbs. Of course, this was pure coincidence. The herbs did nothing against the real cause of plague. But in a world without modern medicine, people desperately grabbed onto anything that seemed to offer protection. Other new habits have emerged too. People boil water before drinking it. They burn the clothing of the dead instead of reusing it. They quarantine newcomers to the village for days before allowing them to mix freely. Some of these practices, though based on flawed understanding, accidentally did help reduce disease transmission. Boiling water kills many pathogens. Burning contaminated clothing eliminates flea habitats. Quarantine can prevent contagion spread. Through tragic trial and error, medieval people were developing public health measures that actually worked. One evening, as you're finishing work, you notice smoke rising from the edge of the village. Following it, you find a group burning a huge pile of straw mattresses and old clothing. Winter cleaning, explains an older woman overseeing the burning, getting rid of anything that might harbour the pestilence before the cold drives us all indoors. Another unintended benefit, destroying flea habitats before winter when people would crowd together in enclosed spaces, sharing warmth and, unfortunately, parasites. As winter approaches, you realize how much your life has changed in a single year, from a field worker bound to the land to an apprentice in a trade, from sleeping on straw in a crowded family hut to having your own cottage with a real bed, from near starvation to regular meals with meat. But there's something else too, a newfound respect. People who once would have ignored you now negotiate with you. Your opinion matters. Your skills have value. You are no longer just another pair of hands in the field, interchangeable and disposable. One cold November evening, you're sitting in the village alehouse, another luxury you can now afford, when the newly installed bailiff enters. Before the plague, the bailiff was the Lord's enforcer, often feared and resented. This one looks barely older than you, thrust into the role by necessity. He calls for attention. The Lord requires 3 men to repair the mill before winter sets in. 6 days' work, 30 pennies per day. A few months ago, that would have been an astronomical wage. Now there's little reaction from the alehouse patrons. 35, calls out a man by the fire, and ale provided. The bailiff looks like he wants to argue, but just nods tiredly. Fine, who will take the work? 3 men eventually volunteer, but only after extracting promises about the exact hours and conditions. The bailiff leaves, looking defeated. Saw the old lord turn a man's bones to jelly for talking back like that, comments an older patron after the bailiff leaves. Now they're practically begging us to work. Agnes, who has joined you for a drink, leans in. It won't last, she says quietly. The nobles and merchants, they're not going to accept this new order forever. They'll find a way to push us back down. She's more right than she knows. Even as you enjoy your new status and comfort, forces are already working to restore the old hierarchies. In England, the first labour laws freezing wages will be enacted in 1351. In France, similar attempts to control labour costs are being implemented. But for now, in this strange window between the plague's devastation and the elite's reassertion of control, ordinary people are experiencing something rare: leverage. Later that night, returning to your cottage, you notice how different the village looks, not just because of the empty houses or the fewer people, but because of the improvements. Homes that once were simple wooden structures are being rebuilt with stone foundations. Windows that once were just openings covered with shutters now have oiled paper or even glass. People are using their new wealth to live better. Inside your own home, you light a candle. Beeswax, not tallow, another small luxury you can now afford. The mattress on your bed is stuffed with wool rather than straw. A copper pot hangs by the fire instead of a clay one. These material improvements might seem small from our modern perspective, but they represented significant quality of life changes. Better housing meant warmer, drier living conditions. Better bedding meant better sleep and fewer parasites. Better cooking implements meant more nutritious food preparation. All these improvements added up to something significant. People were living longer, not dramatically longer. Medieval life was still harsh by our standards, but the survivors of the plague who managed to avoid subsequent outbreaks often lived healthier lives than their pre-plague ancestors, simply because they had access to better nutrition and living conditions. As you drift towards sleep, you reflect on the strange paradox of your time, a world devastated by death, yet offering more opportunity for the living than ever before. Your wool-stuffed mattress is nothing compared to your comfortable modern bed, but compared to the straw pile you slept on a year ago, it feels like luxury. The next day will bring new challenges and opportunities as society continues to transform around you. The old world is gone, swept away by the plague's devastation. What replaces it is still forming, still malleable, and for the first time, people like you have a say in shaping it. Spring has arrived, bringing with it a strange tension to the village. It's been nearly 2 years since the plague swept through, and life has settled into new patterns. You've become skilled at tanning, earning wages that would have been unimaginable before. Agnes is now officially the tanner's wife, though she insisted on keeping her position and her own earnings. But something's shifting. You feel it first in small ways. Whispers in the marketplace, nervous glances when wages are discussed. Then one morning, the village crier arrives with a proclamation. Hear ye, hear ye, his voice carries across the village square. By order of our sovereign Lord King Edward, the following laws are now in effect throughout England. A crowd gathers quickly. Royal proclamations aren't common events in small villages. All labourers, craftsmen and servants, the crier continues, reading from a scroll, shall accept the same wages and terms as were paid in the year 1346, before the great mortality. A murmur ripples through the crowd. 1346 wages, that's less than half what most people are earning now. Furthermore, the crier raises his voice over the growing noise. It shall be illegal for any able-bodied man or woman to refuse suitable work when offered. Those violating these laws shall be fined or imprisoned. The crowd erupts. Someone throws a turnip at the crier, who ducks and continues reading even louder. These laws are enacted for the common good, to prevent the realm from falling into ruin due to excessive wages and idle hands. What you're witnessing is the Statute of Labourers, enacted in 1351. It was a direct response by the ruling class to the economic changes we've been following. Landowners, nobles, and wealthy merchants were horrified by rising wages and workers' new mobility. This law was their attempt to turn back the clock to before the plague. As the crier finishes and hurries away, the village explodes in angry conversation. They can't enforce this, a carpenter declares. Who's going to make me work for half my worth? The king's sheriffs, you idiot, replies a woman clutching a basket, and they'll throw you in a cell if you refuse. Master Fuller pushes through the crowd toward you and Agnes. His face is thunderous. Back to the tannery, now. Once you're back at the workshop, away from prying ears, he paces in agitation. This is bad, very bad. You're not actually going to cut our wages, are you? Agnes asks directly. The tanner runs a hand through his thinning hair. Not if I can help it, but they've appointed enforcers in every county. They'll be checking guild records, questioning workers. So what do we do? You ask. He thinks for a moment. On paper, you'll be paid the old wage rates, but... He lowers his voice, though there's no one else around. I can provide your meals. A cart of firewood might appear by your cottage each week. A winter coat might be a gift, not payment. This kind of under-the-table compensation became common. Employers who valued their workers found ways around the wage freezes. Some provided housing, food, or goods in addition to the mandated lower wages. Others simply ignored the law when they could get away with it. But the authorities were serious about enforcement. 2 weeks later, you see that seriousness firsthand. The weekly market is interrupted by the arrival of the sheriff and 4 armed men. They drag a stonemason into the square and force him to his knees. This man, announces the sheriff, demanded 3 pennies per day for his labour on the church repairs. When the legal rate is 1.5, he has been found guilty of violating the statute of labourers. The crowd watches in uneasy silence as the sheriff continues. The penalty is 3 days in the stocks and a fine of 20 shillings. The mason is forced into the wooden stocks at the edge of the square, his head and hands locked into the uncomfortable restraints where he'll remain exposed to the elements and public humiliation. Let this be a warning, the sheriff calls out. The king's law will be enforced. That evening, under cover of darkness, villagers secretly bring water and food to the mason. One person even holds a cloak over him during a brief rainfall. Small acts of solidarity, but meaningful. When the sheriff's men aren't around, people discuss the situation openly. The nobles are terrified, explains an old merchant who travels between villages. They've lived their whole lives with peasants under their thumb. Now that we have some leverage, they're using the king's power to crush us. Can they really turn everything back to how it was before? Someone asks. The merchant snorts. They can try, but there are fewer workers now, and that's a fact they can't change with any law. He's right. The fundamental economic reality, a drastically reduced workforce, couldn't be erased by legislation, but the ruling class had centuries of experience maintaining control, and they were using every tool at their disposal. A month after the proclamation, the tanner calls everyone together again. The guild has been ordered to keep detailed records of all workers and their wages, he explains grimly. Inspections will be random. Anyone found receiving extra compensation will be fined, along with their employer. So our arrangement, you begin, has to stop, he finishes, looking genuinely regretful. They're watching too closely now. Just like that, your income is cut in half. The comfortable life you've built begins to crumble at the edges. The small luxuries go first. No more meat with every meal, no more fine candles. Then larger sacrifices follow. You have to give up the cottage you were renting and move back to the tanner's shed to save money. You're not alone in these reversals. Across the village, people who had begun to improve their circumstances find themselves pushed back down. The brief window of opportunity seems to be closing, but humans are remarkably adaptable, especially when motivated by self-interest. New forms of resistance emerge. Need a hand with that garden? Asks a farmer's widow one evening as you're struggling to dig a small plot behind the tannery shed. I can't pay you, you admit. "Didn't offer it for coin," she replies, "but I've got more turnips than I can eat, and that leather vest you're making looks about my size." Bartering becomes the new currency, direct exchanges of goods and services that bypass the regulated wage system. It's technically against the spirit of the law, but harder to track and punish than straightforward wage violations. Other forms of resistance are less subtle. Work slowdowns become common. If you're being paid half what you're worth, why work at full speed? "Taking your time with those hides," Agnes observes one afternoon as you methodically scrape at a pace that would have earned you a scolding months ago. "Worth half the pay, half the effort," you reply. She glances around to ensure no one's listening. "Just be careful. The master's under pressure from the guild. They've started fining workshops that don't meet quotas. This pressure creates tension between workers and employers, both of whom are caught in a system neither created." Master Fuller, once reasonably fair in his dealings, grows snappish and demanding as guild expectations increase while his workforce's motivation decreases. "I could have you replaced," he threatens after finding you taking an unauthorized break. "With who?" you challenge, knowing that even with reduced wages, workers are still scarce. "Good luck finding someone who knows how to prepare the lime pits properly. It's a dangerous game of chicken. You need the work, however poorly paid. He needs your skills, which would take months to replace. Neither can afford to break completely with the other." The situation in cities is even more volatile. When a travelling peddler visits the village, he brings news from London. The guilds there have hired thugs to intimidate workers, he tells the crowd at the alehouse. Anyone suspected of accepting higher than legal wages gets a midnight visit. Men have been beaten, workshops vandalised. "And how are people responding?" someone asks. The peddler leans in. Workers are organising too. Secret meetings, codes to identify each other. Some talk of revolt, though that's dangerous talk. He taps his nose meaningfully. The walls have ears these days. Indeed, another development of this period was the rise of informants. Authorities offered rewards for reporting wage violations or worker organisations. Neighbours informed on neighbours, creating an atmosphere of suspicion. One morning, you arrive at the tannery to find Agnes looking pale and worried. "Martin was arrested last night," she says quietly. Martin, the older man who worked alongside you, had become something of a mentor. "What for?" you ask, though you can guess. "Sheriff said he was organising workers planning to demand higher wages again." She rubs her arms nervously. "They said he'll be made an example." 2 days later, that example is made public. Martin is brought to the village square, his hands bound. The sheriff reads the charges: incitement, conspiracy to violate the labour statutes, insubordination. The punishment is severe: public branding on the face with an F for false, meaning oathbreaker, followed by imprisonment. As they heat the branding iron, the crowd grows restless. There are mutterings, angry glances. For a moment it seems like they might intervene. The sheriff senses it too and calls his men into a tighter formation around the prisoner. The tension builds until one of the wealthier villagers, a merchant who's benefited from lower wages for his workers, steps forward. "If I pay his fine, will you spare the brand and jail?" he offers. The sheriff considers, then nods curtly. Money changes hands, and Martin is released with just a warning. The crowd disperses, crisis averted for the moment. Later, you ask the merchant why he intervened. "Don't mistake me for some champion of workers," he replies frankly, "but a branded imprisoned man produces nothing and buys nothing. Bad for business, and a riot would be even worse." It's a coldly practical answer, but it illustrates something important. The economy still needed to function. Even with the restrictive laws, there was a limit to how far authorities could push before the system itself would break down. This uneasy balance continued through 1351 and 1352. The laws remained, the punishments were real, but on the ground, 1,000 small compromises and adjustments allowed life to continue. Some workers simply moved to areas with less stringent enforcement. You consider this option yourself after hearing that coastal towns are paying double the legal rate for skilled workers, the local authorities turning a blind eye out of practical necessity. I could go to Bristol, you mentioned to Agnes one day. Start fresh where no one's watching so closely. And be a stranger with no connections when the next plague outbreak comes, she counters. At least here we have a community, people who'll help each other. She has a point. Despite the economic repression, social bonds have strengthened among survivors. People who lived through the horror of the plague together share a connection that newcomers wouldn't have. By late 1352, 5 years after the plague first appeared in Europe, a peculiar new normal has established itself. On paper, the old hierarchies are reasserted. In practice, a complex web of workarounds and resistance keeps workers from slipping back to their pre-plague status. You see it at the Christmas feast in the village church. The new priest, the nervous young man, has been replaced yet again, leads prayers before the community meal. Looking around, you note how the seating arrangement has subtly changed from years past. Before the plague, the noble family would have been separate, elevated. Craftsmen and peasants would have known their places, rigidly defined. Now, while there's still a hierarchy, the boundaries are blurrier. The Lord's son turned Lord sits only slightly apart. Conversations flow more freely between ranks. Everyone has lost someone. Everyone has had to adapt. The food, too, tells a story. Despite the wage restrictions, ordinary people are eating better than they did before the plague. There's more meat, more varied dishes. With fewer mouths to feed and the same amount of agricultural land, food production per person has actually increased. After the meal, an impromptu dance begins. You find yourself partnered with a merchant's daughter, something that would have raised eyebrows before. As you move through the steps of a circle dance, you catch snippets of conversations from around the room. Thinking of appealing to the king's court. Can't find anyone willing to thatch the roof for the legal wage. Sheriff's been taking bribes to look the other way. Heard there's good land available up north. Each comment reflects the ongoing negotiation between the law as written and reality as lived. The statute of labourers hasn't failed entirely. Wages have indeed fallen from their immediate post-plague highs, but neither has it fully succeeded in restoring the pre-plague order. As the night winds down, you walk back to your shed with a full stomach and conflicted thoughts. Your life is harder than it was a year ago, when wages were at their peak, yet it's still better than it would have been if the plague had never happened. The stars above are brilliant in the winter sky, the same stars that shone down on this land long before the plague and will continue long after everyone now living is gone. From that vast perspective, even the catastrophe of the Black Death is just a moment in time. Terrible, transformative, but ultimately just one chapter in humanity's long story. And that's a comforting thought as you settle onto your straw mattress, so different from your soft bed today. Despite all attempts to freeze time and preserve old power structures, change continues, sometimes visibly in proclamations and punishments, sometimes invisibly in 1,000 small acts of negotiation and resistance. Tomorrow, you'll return to the tannery. You'll work for less than your worth, but more than your father ever earned. You'll navigate the complex new reality, finding paths between compliance and defiance. You'll survive as humans always have by adapting. And unlike the comfortable certainty of your modern life, medieval survivors lived with daily reminders that nothing was guaranteed. Not health, not status, not even the social order itself. The plague had revealed how quickly everything could change, a lesson none of them would ever forget. 10 years have passed since you first became a tanner's apprentice. You're now a respected craftsman in your own right, having taken over the workshop 3 years ago when Master Fuller died of a winter fever. Agnes still works alongside you, though she's teaching her eldest daughter the trade now too. The world has changed in subtle ways. The initial shock of the plague has faded into memory, though no one who lived through it will ever forget. The desperate labour shortages have eased somewhat as children born after the plague have grown old enough to work. Wages have stabilised at a level lower than the post-plague peak, but still higher than before the pestilence. And something else has changed too. The way people think about disease. You notice it first when news comes that plague has reappeared in a town 30 miles away. Before, such news would have caused panic, with people fleeing in all directions, ironically helping to spread the disease further. This time, the reaction is different. The town council has sealed the gates, explains a merchant who managed to leave just before the quarantine. No one in, no one out, until the pestilence has passed. The whole town? Someone asks. Even the healthy? Everyone, the merchant confirms. They've arranged for food to be left outside the walls, no direct contact with outsiders. This is new. During the first plague outbreak, people fled infected areas, spreading the disease wherever they went. Now, communities are learning to isolate themselves when disease appears. They didn't understand exactly why it worked, but they observed that it did. Your village headman calls a meeting to discuss preparations should the plague reach you. The atmosphere is remarkably calm, not because people aren't afraid, but because they now have strategies beyond prayer and flight. We should appoint plague wardens, suggests the miller, to check for signs of sickness in each household. Others nod in agreement. The idea of designated officials monitoring public health was taking root across Europe. Venice had established a permanent health magistracy, what they called a health office, to oversee sanitation and monitor diseases. And we'll need a place to isolate the sick, adds Agnes, away from the village centre. They settle on an abandoned barn at the edge of the village, which will be cleaned and prepared as a pest house, a place where the infected can be kept separate from the healthy. As the meeting breaks up, the local priest approaches you. "I need leather," he says, without preamble. "50 is enough for a full body covering." "What for?" you ask, curious. "Protection," he replies. "I've heard of a physician in France who treats plague victims while covered from head to toe in leather, with a mask like a bird's beak filled with aromatic herbs. He believes it keeps the poisonous air at bay." What he's describing is the early version of what would become the iconic plague doctor costume: a leather or waxed canvas coat, gloves, boots, hat and a mask with glass eye openings and a beak-like protrusion filled with herbs and spices. While designed based on the flawed miasma theory, the idea that disease spread through bad air, the covering actually did provide some protection against flea bites, which were the real disease vector. You agree to provide the leather, curious to see this strange outfit. When it's completed a week later, the effect is both comical and terrifying. The priest looks like some strange Birdman hybrid, but the purpose is deadly serious. "If the plague comes," he explains, showing how the eye holes are covered with glass, "I can minister to the sick without falling ill myself." Word of the costume spreads, and soon others are requesting similar protective gear. You find yourself developing an unexpected specialty in medical protective wear, adapting designs based on feedback from users. This kind of practical innovation was happening across Europe, with universities having lost up to 2/3 of their physicians during the plague. Medical knowledge was becoming less theoretical and more experimental. People tried different approaches, noted what worked, and shared that knowledge. When summer arrives, bringing hot weather and worries about disease, your village implements another new practice: warning systems for infected houses. Each home with illness must mark their door with a white cloth, announces the headman. No one enters or leaves except the plague wardens and priest. This system of marking infected households became common across Europe. In some places, they used red crosses painted on doors or posted guards outside plague houses. The goal was the same: containment through isolation, but the most significant development comes from Venice, brought to you by an Italian leather merchant. They've built a special facility on an island in the lagoon, he tells you as you negotiate over a shipment of tanning supplies. Any ship with suspected illness aboard must anchor there for 40 days before entering the city. 40 days? You're skeptical. That seems excessive. 40 giorni, he says with a shrug. 40 days. Long enough to be sure no hidden sickness will emerge. They call it quarantine. This was indeed the birth of modern quarantine, the word itself coming from the Italian for 40 days. The practice began in the Venetian-controlled port of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, in 1377, then spread to Venice and other Mediterranean ports. Does it work, you ask? Venice has avoided major plague outbreaks since they implemented it, the merchant replies, while other cities have suffered terribly. The concept soon extends beyond ports. When a messenger arrives from a neighbouring village where illness has appeared, he's not allowed past the village boundary. Instead, he must leave his messages in a bucket of vinegar at a designated spot where they're retrieved only after soaking for hours. Vinegar was believed to purify objects contaminated by plague, and surprisingly, there was some merit to this. The acid in vinegar can kill certain bacteria, though not the plague bacterium itself. Still, the practice of disinfecting potentially contaminated items was a step toward modern sanitation. By 1365, almost 20 years after the first plague outbreak, medical knowledge has evolved significantly. No one yet understands the true cause, bacteria carried by fleas on rats, but practical experience has led to effective preventative measures. You see this evolution in action when a travelling physician visits your village. Unlike the university-trained doctors before the plague, who relied heavily on ancient texts by Galen and other classical authorities, this new breed of healer emphasises observation and results. "I don't bleed my patients," he announces, contradicting centuries of medical practice. "I've observed that those who are bled during plague sicken and die faster than those left alone." This kind of empirical approach, based on observation rather than authority, marked a significant shift in medical thinking. The catastrophic failure of traditional medicine during the Black Death had created space for new approaches. The physician shares other observations. Plague seems to strike less often in homes that are kept clean, with few rats and mice. I advise all households to keep cats and to store food in covered containers. Again, without understanding the exact mechanism, people were identifying practices that actually helped reduce disease transmission by limiting contact with plague-carrying rodents. Your own workshop has implemented many of these new practices. Where once scraps and waste accumulated freely, now everything is carefully disposed of. The workshop is swept daily, and cats prowl freely, keeping the rodent population in check. One autumn day, a stranger staggers into the village square, clearly ill with fever. Before anyone can approach, the village plague warden intercepts him. "Stay back," he shouts to the gathering crowd. "No one touch him." The sick man is given water and food, but kept isolated in a small hut outside the village. The priest, wearing his leather costume, goes to offer comfort and assess the illness. When he returns, the village holds its collective breath. "Not plague," the priest announces to audible sighs of relief. "A marsh fever, I believe. Still, he should remain apart until recovered." This caution, this systematic approach to potential contagion, represents a profound shift from the pre-plague world, where once disease was seen primarily as divine punishment or bad luck. Now it's treated as something that can be managed through human intervention. Even children's games have changed to reflect this new understanding. You watch your neighbour's children playing in the square one evening. "Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down." They chant, spinning in a circle before collapsing in giggles. The rhyme is new, one of many that emerged in the plague's aftermath, though modern scholars debate whether it actually refers to plague symptoms, the rosy rash, and preventatives, posies of herbs. It shows how deeply the experience of epidemic disease penetrated every aspect of culture, even children's play. By 1370, your village has experienced another small outbreak of plague, not nearly as devastating as the first wave, but frightening nonetheless. However, the new systems proved effective, isolating the sick, marking affected households, implementing village-wide cleaning efforts, and restricting travel. The results are striking. While 6 families fell ill, the disease didn't spread through the entire community as it had before. People still died. Medicine remained primitive by our standards, but not on the apocalyptic scale of the initial outbreak. One evening, sitting outside your workshop, you overhear 2 young men talking. Neither was born when the Great Plague struck. They know it only through stories. "My father says it was God's judgment," one says, "for the sins of mankind." "My grandmother says it was poisoned wells," replies the other. "She still won't drink from public fountains." You smile slightly at these old explanations. While religious interpretations remain common and conspiracy theories about deliberate poisoning still circulate, practical knowledge has advanced regardless. "Actually," you interject, "it seems to have something to do with uncleanliness and rats. Keep your home clean, keep cats to catch rats, avoid those who are ill, and your chances are better." They listen respectfully. You're an elder now, someone who survived the Great Dying. Your empirical wisdom carries weight with the younger generation. This generational transmission of practical knowledge was crucial. Without understanding the scientific mechanism, communities developed and passed down effective public health measures based on observed results. By 1374, 27 years after the Black Death first struck Europe, Venice implements another innovation, the first permanent quarantine station, or lazaretto, on an island in its lagoon. Ships, goods, and people suspected of carrying contagion would be detained there before being allowed into the city. When news of this reaches your village through travelling merchants, it prompts discussion at the alehouse. "Seems the Venetians have the right idea," comments the miller. "Stop the pestilence before it enters the community." "We should do the same," adds another villager. "Build a house outside the village for travellers to stay in for a week before entering." The idea gains support, and within months, your village has its own simple quarantine station. Just a small hut with basic amenities, but a significant step in community health protection. You're asked to provide leather for a special door that can be cleaned easily and for protective aprons for those who will manage the station. Your trade, once simply about making shoes and saddles, has evolved to include these medical applications. This practical ingenuity characterized the post-plague medical world. Without modern scientific understanding, people nevertheless developed effective strategies through observation, experimentation, and sharing of knowledge. On a personal level, these changes have affected your daily habits too. You wash more frequently than you would have before the plague. You keep your living quarters cleaner. You pay attention to signs of illness in yourself and others. You understand, at least intuitively, concepts of contagion and prevention that were not common knowledge before. One hot summer day, as you're working outside your shop, you notice a man watching you from across the square. There's something vaguely familiar about him, though you can't place him at first. When he approaches, recognition dawns. "Martin?" you ask uncertainly. It is indeed Martin, the older worker who was arrested for organizing laborers over 20 years ago. His hair has gone completely white, and he walks with a slight limp, but his eyes are the same. "Didn't think you'd remember me," he says with a smile. You invite him to sit, offering a cup of ale. He takes it gratefully, explaining that he's been traveling through the region, working where he can. "Things have changed," he observes, looking around the village. "Some things." You agree. Wages never went back to what they were right after the plague, but they're still better than before, and there are fewer people to lord over us. "I meant the plague markers," he clarifies, nodding toward a house with a white cloth tied to the door, not indicating plague itself, but a general illness that warranted caution. "In my father's day, illness was private. Now it's everyone's business." He's identified something profound. The shift from health as a personal matter to a community concern. This public health approach, born of necessity during the plague years, represented a fundamental change in how society approached disease. As the sun sets and Martin prepares to continue his journey, he leaves you with a thought that captures the strange duality of your post-plague world. "The pestilence took half of everything we knew," he says, "but it taught the survivors to hold on to what remained with both hands." It's a sentiment that resonates as you return to your workshop. The plague was undoubtedly one of history's great catastrophes, yet the world it left behind wasn't simply a diminished version of what came before. It was something new, a society that had learned, adapted, and in some ways improved, even through unimaginable suffering. As darkness falls, you close up the tanner's shop and head home. Unlike your medieval counterpart, you'll sleep in a clean, comfortable bed in a world where pandemic disease is largely controllable through the medical knowledge that began developing in those crucial years after the Black Death. The medieval survivors didn't have that comfort, but they had begun the long journey of understanding that would eventually lead to modern medicine, one careful observation and practical innovation at a time. 30 years have now passed since the Black Death first swept through Europe. You've grown older, your once dark hair now streaked with grey. The tannery has prospered under your management, and you've trained several apprentices who've gone on to establish their own workshops in neighbouring villages. The world has changed around you too. Children born after the plague are now adults with children of their own. To them, the great mortality is just a story told by their elders, not a lived memory. But its effects continue to shape society in ways both obvious and subtle. It's a cool autumn morning in 1380 when the royal tax collector arrives in your village. His appearance causes an immediate stir. Tax collectors are never welcome visitors, but lately they've become even more despised. Another tax, grumbles the blacksmith as people gather reluctantly in the village square. They just collected last spring. The tax collector, a thin man with nervous eyes, unrolls a scroll. By order of the King's Council, a new poll tax is hereby levied on all persons above the age of 15, regardless of status or income. Each must pay 3 groats. The crowd's murmuring grows louder. Poll taxes, fixed amounts charged per person regardless of wealth, hit the poor far harder than the rich, and this is the 3rd such tax in just 4 years. 3 groats, calls out a farmer. That's nearly a week's wages for a labourer. The tax collector ignores the protests, continuing to read from his scroll. Payment is due within the month. Those failing to pay will face imprisonment. As he finishes, he glances up nervously at the increasingly hostile crowd and hurriedly adds, "I merely deliver the message. The tax was approved by Parliament." Agnes, now in her 60s but still sharp-tongued, pushes to the front. And who sits in Parliament? Not people like us. She's right. Parliament at this time was dominated by wealthy landowners and merchants. The common people had no direct representation. After the tax collector leaves, escorted to the village boundary by the headman, the crowd doesn't disperse. Instead, the conversation grows more heated. First they forced wages down with their statutes, says a mason. Now they take what little we earn with these poll taxes. They say it's for the French wars, adds another. Why should we pay for the King's wars? What do we get from them? The frustration you're witnessing wasn't unique to your village. Across England, similar conversations were happening. 30 years of economic suppression following the brief post-plague empowerment had built up tremendous resentment. The poll taxes were simply the spark that would eventually ignite this powder keg. Later that evening, a stranger appears at the alehouse, a man in simple clothes who nevertheless speaks with unusual education. He buys a round of drinks and listens to the villagers' complaints about the new tax. It's the same everywhere, he says finally. From Kent to Yorkshire, working people are being squeezed dry. And what's to be done about it? Asks a young farmer bitterly. They have swords. We have ploughshares. The stranger leans forward. Men are organising. In Essex, in Kent, secret meetings. Talk of action. The alehouse grows quiet. This kind of talk could be considered sedition. What kind of action, you ask cautiously. The stranger gives you a measuring look before answering. A petition, at first. Thousands of voices together might be heard where dozens are ignored. And if not, he leaves the implication hanging. Over the next weeks, you hear more rumours of these meetings. Some of the younger men from your village begin disappearing in the evenings, returning late with excited expressions but closed mouths. Agnes's grandson, Thomas, now works in your tannery. One morning, you notice a fresh bruise on his cheek. "Walk into a door, did you?" you ask, knowing better. The young man glances around to ensure no one's listening. "There was a meeting last night. King's men broke it up." "You're playing a dangerous game," you warn. Thomas straightens. "Is it a game to want fair treatment? They push us down with one hand and take our money with the other." You can't argue with him. You've lived through the entire cycle. The brief window of opportunity after the plague, the legal clampdown that followed, and now these crushing new taxes. As winter approaches, tax collection begins in earnest. The results are ugly. In some households, people sell essential belongings to raise the money. In others, particularly those with several adult members, payment is simply impossible. You witness a family being evicted from their cottage, their few possessions confiscated to pay their tax debt. The mother clutches a crying infant while the father stands helplessly by. Their older children, including a daughter barely 16, are taken to the town jail until the debt is paid, which, without their labour, becomes even less likely. This scene was repeated across England, feeding growing outrage. The authorities seem to have forgotten a crucial lesson from the plague years. When people have nothing left to lose, they become dangerous. The winter of 1380-1381 is tense. Secret meetings continue despite crackdowns. Messages pass between villages carried by travelling workers or peddlers. There's talk of coordinated resistance come spring. In May of 1381, the spark finally catches. Word arrives from Essex that tax collectors there have been driven out by angry crowds. Similar incidents quickly spread through Kent. They say a man called Wat Tyler leads them in Kent, Thomas tells you excitedly. And there's a priest, John Ball, who preaches that all men are created equal, that serfdom is against God's will. John Ball's famous line, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" questioned the very foundation of the feudal hierarchy. If Adam and Eve were the first humans and they worked with their hands, then on what basis did aristocrats claim superiority? The news gets more dramatic by the day. What began as scattered tax resistance has swelled into organised rebellion. Thousands of commoners are marching on London itself, led by Tyler and other newly emerged leaders. Your village is too far north to join the main rebellion, but the excitement is palpable. Some young men, including Thomas, leave to join the marchers. Others begin refusing local authorities' demands. The village priest, reading the mood of his congregation, delivers a sermon that carefully avoids condemning the rebels. Our Lord Jesus ate with tax collectors, but he also cast the money changers from the temple. For about 2 weeks, remarkable news continues to arrive. The rebels have reached London. They've opened the prisons. They've executed the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord High Treasurer, and other officials seen as responsible for the poll tax. Most incredibly, the 14-year-old King Richard II met with the rebels at Mile End and agreed to their demands, including the abolition of serfdom. Hope surges through the countryside. Could this actually be happening? Could the old order truly be overturned? Then comes the crushing sequel. Wat Tyler was killed during a second meeting with the king at Smithfield. Without his leadership, the rebel forces fragmented. The king retracted his concessions. Royal forces regrouped and began a brutal crackdown on the rebels. The news hits your village like a physical blow. Thomas and the others who left haven't returned. No one knows if they're dead, captured, or in hiding. The authorities waste no time reasserting control. An armed force arrives in your village, led by a minor noble. "By order of the king," he announces, "all illegal assemblies are henceforth banned. Any man found to have participated in rebellion will be executed. The poll tax will be collected in full." To demonstrate their seriousness, they drag the village headman into the square. This man failed to report seditious meetings, the noble declares. His punishment is 40 lashes. You watch, sickened, as the headman is tied to a post and flogged until his back is a bloody mess. He's left there as a warning while the armed men go house to house, searching for any sign of rebel involvement. When they reach your tannery, the noble wrinkles his nose at the smell, a reaction you've seen 1,000 times. "Any of your workers join the rabble in London?" he demands. You think of Thomas, who might very well be dead already. "No, my lord, we've been busy with spring orders." He studies you suspiciously but has no evidence to the contrary. Before leaving, he adds, "The king requires leather for his army's equipment. You'll provide 10 hides, top quality, as a loyalty tax." It's not a request. After they leave, Agnes emerges from where she'd been hiding in the back of the workshop. "You lied to protect Thomas," she says quietly. "I did, you admit, though I may have damned myself in the process." She takes your hand, her skin papery with age. "This isn't over," she says with surprising conviction. "They've won today, but they've shown their fear. They wouldn't bring armies to crush peasants if they weren't afraid." In the weeks that follow, the extent of the repression becomes clear. Hundreds of rebels are executed. Those who can't flee are forced to identify their leaders. Communities are collectively punished with special taxes and loss of traditional rights. But Agnes was right about one thing. The authorities' response betrayed their fear. The rebellion had come shockingly close to success. For a brief moment, the common people had forced the most powerful figures in the realm to listen to their demands. One evening, as you're closing up the tannery, a hooded figure slips inside. When he pushes back his hood, you're startled to see Thomas, thinner, with a healing scar across his forehead, but very much alive. "Thomas, your grandmother's been sick with worry. I couldn't come back until now," he explains. "They were hanging anyone who'd been in London. Were you there? Did you see the king? Despite yourself, you're curious about events you've only heard described second-hand." "I was there when the Savoy Palace burned," he says, naming the luxurious London residence of the king's uncle, John of Gaunt, which rebels had destroyed. "I saw the Tower of London opened and the prisoners freed. For 3 days, London belonged to the people." His eyes shine with the memory, despite the rebellion's failure. "And now?" you ask. His expression darkens. "Now I'm a wanted man. I need to leave England. There are ships in the northern ports taking wool to Flanders. I thought perhaps with your connections to the merchants you should refuse. Helping him could mean your own death if discovered." But you remember being his age. Remember the hope of those early post-plague years when it seemed the old order might truly change. "I know someone," you say finally, "a wool merchant who owes me a favour, but you'll need to hide until arrangements can be made." For the next week, Thomas hides in your cellar while you contact the merchant. Eventually, a plan is made. Thomas will be smuggled out disguised as the merchant's servant bound for Bruges. The night before he's to leave, you sit together sharing a jug of ale. "Do you regret it?" you ask, "joining the rebellion?" Thomas considers the question seriously. "We failed," he admits, "but for a moment they saw us, not as serfs or labourers or tanners, but as men whose voices mattered." He takes a drink before adding, "That's worth something." It's a perspective that historians would later validate. While the peasants' revolt was crushed, it left lasting impacts. The poll tax was abandoned. Though serfdom wasn't abolished outright, the practice declined more rapidly in England than elsewhere in Europe. Perhaps most importantly, the idea that common people could organise effectively to demand rights had been demonstrated a dangerous precedent from the authorities' perspective. Thomas leaves before dawn, and you never learn his ultimate fate, but his parting words stay with you. "The world my children will know won't be the same as the one my grandfather lived in. We've changed things even if we don't live to see it." Indeed, though the immediate aftermath of the revolt brought harsh repression, the long-term trajectory couldn't be reversed. The plague had set in motion economic and social changes that would eventually undermine the feudal system entirely, regardless of laws and crackdowns. In France, similar tensions led to the Jacquerie Rebellion of 1358. In Florence, the Ciompi Revolt of 1378 saw textile workers briefly take control of the city government. Across Europe, the lower classes were increasingly willing to risk everything to challenge a system they now recognized was not divinely ordained but humanly constructed and therefore could be changed. As an older member of the community, you're now in an unusual position. You remember both the world before the plague and the tumultuous decades after. You've seen how profoundly society can change, even when powerful forces resist. You understand, in a way the young rebels don't, that change often comes slowly, in fits and starts, with reversals along the way. Later that summer, news arrives that the young King Richard II has dismissed some of the most hated officials responsible for the poll tax. It's a small concession, but perhaps a sign that some lessons have been learned. The village gradually returns to normal, or what passes for normal in this transformed world. The tannery continues its work. New apprentices replace those who've moved on. The rhythms of rural life reassert themselves. But underneath that apparent normalcy, the social contract has been irrevocably altered. The lords and authorities still hold power, but their subjects now understand that power is not absolute. The commons, ordinary working people, have discovered their collective strength, a discovery they will not entirely forget. One afternoon, you're teaching a new apprentice how to prepare a hide for tanning when the conversation turns to the rebellion. "My father says it was all for nothing," the boy says. "The nobles still rule, we still pay taxes." You think about how to respond, how to explain the complex legacy of those turbulent days. Finally, you say, "When the plague first came, it seemed like the end of everything, but those who survived found opportunities no one had imagined before." You run your hand over the leather, feeling its transformation from raw hide to useful material. The rebellion might look like failure now, but it planted seeds. Your grandchildren might yet harvest what we've sown. As you say these words, you realize you've come to believe them. The arc of change is longer than any single life, but the direction is clear. The old medieval world, with its rigid hierarchies and immutable social boundaries, is slowly giving way to something new. Not utopia, but a society where even common folk might have a voice. That night, as you walk home through the village, you pass the church where weathered stone memorializes generations past. Inside those walls, prayers have been offered for plague victims, for rebels, for kings. The building stands as it has for centuries, seemingly unchanging. But you know better. You've seen change come in both cataclysmic waves and in barely perceptible shifts. You understand now that nothing, not social order, not authority, not even the church, is truly permanent. It's a perspective that your modern, comfortable life rarely forces you to confront. Unlike medieval survivors of plague and rebellion, you likely take stability for granted, assume that tomorrow will resemble today in all meaningful ways. Yet the lesson of the post-plague decades remains valuable. Systems that appear immutable can transform, sometimes through disaster, sometimes through resistance, sometimes through the slow pressure of economic reality. What matters is not just the change itself, but who has a voice in shaping what comes after. The summer of 1374 brings something strange to your region. At first, it's just rumours carried by travellers, tales so bizarre you dismiss them as exaggerations or outright fabrications, but then you witness it yourself when visiting a neighbouring town for a leather fair. In the town square, a group of people are dancing, not the organized circle dances of festivals or the dignified paired movements of court dances, but wild, seemingly uncontrollable spasming. Men and women of all ages leap and twirl, arms flailing, bodies contorting. Their faces show expressions ranging from ecstasy to agony. Some cry out, some laugh hysterically, others seem trapped in a waking nightmare. Most disturbing is the duration. They've reportedly been dancing for hours. As you watch, one woman collapses, foaming at the mouth. Others dance until their feet bleed through their shoes, yet still continue. What is happening to them? You ask a bystander. Dancing plague, the man replies grimly. Started 3 days ago with just one woman. Now look, 20 or more. This was a real phenomenon, documented across Europe in the decades following the Black Death. In places like Aachen, Liège, and Utrecht, groups of people would dance uncontrollably for hours or days, unable to stop even as they collapsed from exhaustion. Are they possessed? Asks someone else in the crowd. Perhaps, says a cleric who's watching with obvious distress. Or perhaps it's the plague returning in a different form. Others have their own theories. It's from dancing over unmarked plague graves, says an old woman. The dead are jealous of the living. It's St. Vitus's curse, counters another, for neglecting his feast day. You watch, transfixed by the horrifying spectacle, until Agnes tugs your sleeve. We should go, she says quietly. Some think it spreads like plague by bad air or proximity. As you turn to leave, you notice something odd about the crowd watching the dancers. Many hold posies of herbs to their noses, a plague time precaution. Others make protective signs against evil. But strangest of all is the look in some eyes. Not just fear or disgust, but a kind of longing, as if part of them wants to join the frenzied dance. The dancing plague wasn't the only strange mass phenomenon to emerge in the plague's aftermath. As you travel more for your leather business over the next decade, you witness other bizarre outbreaks. A laughing epidemic that swept through 3 villages in Bavaria. Children who spoke in tongues after a religious procession. A town where hundreds claimed to simultaneously see the Virgin Mary in the clouds. Modern historians and psychologists now believe these were forms of mass psychogenic illness, physical symptoms caused by psychological distress, spreading through social contagion. The immense trauma of the Black Death, which killed so many and overturned the social order, created a population primed for such outbreaks. But for people of the time, these events required different explanations. Divine intervention, demonic possession, or new forms of physical disease. By 1380, now in your 60s, you've developed a reputation as one of the plague-wise, those who lived through the great mortality and gained practical knowledge about survival. Young people sometimes seek you out for advice or stories, especially when rumors of disease surface. Is it true, asks the daughter of the village baker one day, that you can tell if someone will get plague by making them drink sheep urine? My cousin says if it makes them vomit, they're already infected. You shake your head. That's nonsense. No one can predict who will get sick. These kinds of strange folk remedies and diagnostic methods had proliferated in the decades since the plague. Some were harmless, like carrying herbs or reciting certain prayers. Others were dangerous, like consuming toxic substances believed to prevent infection. Then how did you survive when so many died? She persists. It's a question you've been asked many times, and you still don't have a satisfying answer. Was it luck? Some quirk of your body's resistance? Divine selection? You settled long ago on a practical response. I kept away from the sick when possible. I stayed clean. I ate well when food was available. You shrug. And perhaps God wasn't ready for me yet. This blend of practical precautions and religious fatalism characterized much of the post-plague approach to survival. People did what they could through emerging understandings of contagion, while acknowledging that much remained beyond human control. Religious practices had transformed too. You notice it during the Corpus Christi procession that summer, a festival that had actually gained prominence after the plague. The participants include a new feature, flagellants. These men march bare-chested through the village, rhythmically whipping their own backs with leather straps embedded with metal pieces. Blood runs down their skin as they chant prayers of penitence. They believe suffering will protect them from plague, explains the priest, who watches with a carefully neutral expression. The church's relationship with flagellants was complicated. While self-mortification had religious precedent, the movement had grown so large and independent that it threatened church authority. During the initial plague outbreak, groups of flagellants had travelled from town to town, performing public whipping rituals to appease God's wrath. Ironically, their travels likely helped spread the disease further. Though the Pope eventually banned the practice, smaller groups continued for decades. What's striking is how the community reacts to these bloody displays. Some watch reverently, crossing themselves. Others turn away in disgust. A few look almost envious, as if the flagellants have found certainty in an uncertain world through their extreme devotion. That evening in the alehouse, conversation turns to another strange development of recent years, the obsession with death imagery. "Did you see the new paintings in the church at Thornbury?" asks a wool merchant. "The entire wall is covered with dancing skeletons leading people to their graves, nobles, clergy, peasants, all following death's dance." This was the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, an artistic genre that exploded in popularity after the plague. These images showed death, depicted as a skeleton, choosing victims from all walks of life, emphasizing how no amount of wealth or status could provide immunity. A lesson burned into collective consciousness by the plague's indiscriminate killing. "I saw a similar scene at St. Paul's in London," adds another man. "The skeletal figures seemed to be laughing as they led the living away." The preoccupation with mortality wasn't limited to church art. It permeated daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. Memento mori, remember death, had become a common theme in jewellery, household objects, and even children's toys. Agnes's great-granddaughter, a bright child of 7, shows you her wooden doll, beautifully carved on one side to show a lovely young woman, but when flipped, revealing a grinning skull with worms crawling through the eye sockets. "To remember that beauty doesn't last," the child explains, with disturbing solemnity. "My mother says it helps me focus on heaven instead of earthly things." This morbid sensibility would have seemed bizarre before the plague, particularly for children's playthings, but in a world where death had become so visible and commonplace, acknowledging mortality openly seemed the only honest approach. Even clothing and fashion reflected the post-plague mentality. The sombre, practical styles of earlier medieval periods gave way to more extravagant and even outlandish designs. Men wore shoes with points so long they had to be tied to the wearer's knees with chains. Women adopted towering, horn-shaped headdresses. "Why waste time on modesty when death could come tomorrow?" explains a tailor from London who visits your village with the latest styles. "The rich especially want to display their wealth while they can. After seeing so many nobles buried in mass graves alongside beggars, they're determined to distinguish themselves in life." This eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die attitude characterized much of post-plague culture. Chroniclers complained about declining moral standards, increased gambling, drinking, and sexual licentiousness. While some turned to extreme religious devotion, others embraced hedonism. By 1385, you begin noticing another cultural shift, an increased interest in the vernacular, the common languages people actually spoke, as opposed to Latin. Books and poems written in English, French, Italian, and German become more available and widely discussed. This too was a plague effect. With so many clergy dead, Latin literacy had declined. Meanwhile, the empowerment of the working classes had elevated their languages. Works like Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in English or Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron in Italian reflected this new reality. A travelling scholar stops at your workshop seeking leather for book bindings, and you ask about this trend. "Before the mortality," he explains, "knowledge was tightly controlled by the church and nobility, mostly through Latin, but death made no distinction between those who read Latin and those who didn't. Now people want wisdom in words they can understand." You think about this later as you work on the Scholars' Commission. You never learned to read yourself, but your grandson can, having been taught by the village priest who survived the plague. The idea that knowledge might become more accessible to ordinary people seems like yet another barrier falling in the post-plague world. The 1390s bring another wave of plague to parts of Europe, though less severe than the initial outbreak. Still, it reawakens fears and triggers a fresh round of unusual social behaviours. In some regions, authorities order all dogs and cats killed, believing they spread contagion. This tragically removes the natural predators of rats, potentially making the situation worse. In others, towns require travellers to carry health certificates from their place of origin, an early form of public health documentation. Most bizarrely, you hear of communities where plague survivors are treated as both blessed and cursed, believed to have special powers but also potentially carrying lingering contagion. Some are sought out as healers, while others are shunned. "They say a plague survivor's touch can cure warts and fever," claims a woman selling amulets in the marketplace. "Nonsense," counters a man nearby. "My sister survived the great mortality, and the only thing special about her was her terrible singing." The laughter this provokes reveals another change, the increased use of dark humour to cope with trauma. Jokes about death, plague, and mortality had become surprisingly common. Even church art sometimes included comical elements among the skeletons and demons. This gallows humour served an important psychological purpose, allowing people to process their fears and grief through laughter. It was yet another coping mechanism in a society still coming to terms with unprecedented catastrophe. By 1395, as you approach your 80s, remarkable for a medieval lifespan, you find yourself increasingly reflective. One quiet evening, sitting outside your workshop, watching the sunset with Agnes, now bent and frail but still sharp-minded, you discuss the strange world the plague created. "Remember how they danced until they dropped?" Agnes says, referring to the dancing plague. "Sometimes I think we're all still dancing, just more slowly." "How so?" you ask. "Rushing about, building, trading, fighting, as if keeping busy enough will somehow stop death from noticing us." She smiles wryly. But the plague taught us death notices everyone eventually. A grim lesson, you observe, but a true one, she counters, and truth has value even when painful. Her words capture something essential about your post-plague world. The Black Death had stripped away comfortable illusions about the natural order, about divine protection, about the stability of human institutions. What remained was a kind of harsh realism, a willingness to look directly at mortality and human vulnerability. Yet alongside this grimmer outlook, paradoxically, came greater appreciation for life's pleasures and possibilities. The plague years taught survivors to seize opportunities when they appeared, to find joy where possible, to value human connection in a world where such connections could be suddenly severed. You see this dual awareness in many aspects of late 14th century culture. Churches incorporate both terrifying depictions of hell and more compassionate images of divine mercy. Literature explores both the bleakest human experiences and the most transcendent. Music ranges from solemn requiems to surprisingly bawdy drinking songs. This complex cultural response to mass death would influence European art, literature, philosophy, and religion for centuries. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on humanism and the value of earthly life, grew partly from seeds planted during these strange post-plague decades. As twilight deepens, Agnes points to a group of children playing near the village well, enacting some complicated game involving circles and chanting. "What do you suppose they're playing at?" she asks. You listen to their sing-song voices, ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. The children collapse in giggles, then scramble up to begin again. Whether this nursery rhyme truly originated as a plague reference remains debated by modern scholars. But watching the children transform potential plague imagery, rosy rashes, herbal posies, cremation ashes, falling dead, into innocent play seems to perfectly encapsulate humanity's resilience. "They're playing at survival," you answer finally, "turning our nightmares into their games." Agnes nods thoughtfully. Perhaps that's what we've all been doing in our different ways. As darkness falls completely, you both head inside, moving slowly with the aches and limitations of age. Your cottage, far more comfortable than the home you grew up in before the plague, feels like a testament to how much has changed in your lifetime. Yet for all the material improvements, perhaps the most significant changes were invisible. How people thought about themselves and their place in the world. The plague had demonstrated humanity's fragility, but also its adaptability. It had revealed the arbitrary nature of social hierarchies while simultaneously showing the necessity of community. These contradictory lessons, humility about human power alongside appreciation for human potential, would continue shaping European consciousness long after the last plague victim was buried. As you prepare for sleep, so different from your modern bedtime routine with its electric lights and instant comfort, you reflect on the strange journey from apocalypse to adaptation that you've witnessed. The dancing plagues, death obsessions, and bizarre behaviors were not just footnotes to the Black Death story, but essential elements of how humanity processed unprecedented trauma. Unlike your comfortable bed tonight, a medieval elder would settle onto a simple mattress, perhaps still occasionally jolted awake by memories of those terrible plague years, yet also carrying the hard-won wisdom that life continues, adapts, and even flourishes in the aftermath of catastrophe. The year 1400 arrives, marking the dawn of a new century. You've lived to see it, though few from your generation remain. At over 80 years old, you're now regarded as a living relic, one of the last who remembers the world before the great mortality transformed everything. Your hands, once strong enough to work the toughest leather, are now gnarled with age. You've passed the tannery to your grandson, though you still visit daily to offer advice and, more importantly, to tell stories. The younger workers gather around you in quiet moments, eager to hear about the old days. "What was it like," asks a young apprentice, "before the plague came?" It's a question that makes you pause. How to explain a world that no longer exists? The rigid hierarchies, the certainty of one's place, the unquestioned authorities, concepts increasingly foreign to these children of the post-plague world. More orderly, you finally answer. Everyone knew their place and stayed in it. Sons followed fathers into the same trade. Peasants remained bound to the land. Lords and clergy ruled without question. "Sounds boring," the boy remarks, earning chuckles from the others. Perhaps it was, you admit, but there was security in that order too. Less questioning, less uncertainty. Yet even as you say it, you wonder if that's really how you remember it, or if time has gilded those pre-plague years with a false simplicity. Was the old world truly more secure, or just more confining? Did the appearance of stability merely mask sufferings that went unaddressed? These philosophical musings would have been unlikely for someone of your station in the pre-plague world. That itself is evidence of how profoundly society has changed. Common folk now regularly discuss ideas once reserved for scholars and clergy. Later that week, you accompany your great-grandson to Florence on a leather-selling expedition. The city has transformed since your first visit decades ago. New buildings rise everywhere, their architecture lighter and airier than the heavy medieval structures of your youth. The Duomo, the great cathedral dome designed by Brunelleschi, is under construction. A project of such ambition it would have seemed impossible in the world you were born into. "Grandfather, look." Your great-grandson points to a workshop where a crowd has gathered. Inside, an artist is painting a scene from classical mythology. Not a religious subject, but pagan gods and goddesses rendered with startling realism. This shift in artistic focus from exclusively Christian themes toward classical and secular subjects is one of many changes you've witnessed. After the plague demonstrated the Church's inability to prevent or cure the disease, its cultural monopoly weakened. People still believed, still attended Mass, but with a new willingness to look beyond religious authorities for answers. The artist steps back from his work, and you recognize him as one of Florence's rising stars, a young man named Masaccio. His paintings incorporate new techniques that create the illusion of three-dimensional space on flat surfaces. The crowd murmurs appreciatively as he adds another brushstroke. "They say he paints people as they actually appear," whispers your great-grandson, "not as flat symbols like the old church paintings." This emphasis on realism, on seeing and depicting the world as it actually is, rather than through the lens of religious symbolism, is yet another legacy of the post-plague mentality. Having faced mortality so directly, people seemed less satisfied with abstract representations of life. After watching the artist work, you visit the workshop of a family friend who deals in books and manuscripts. His shelves are filled with works not only in Latin, but in Italian, French, and other vernacular languages. "The latest from Petrarch's followers," he says, showing you a beautifully bound volume. Poetry celebrating human achievement and beauty. Very different from the death-obsessed writings of a few decades ago. Francesco Petrarch had lived through the Black Death himself, writing poignantly about its horrors. Yet he and intellectuals who followed him also helped usher in a new way of thinking, what would later be called humanism, with its focus on human potential rather than solely on divine power. "I'm also getting more requests for classical texts," the bookseller continues. "Plato, Cicero, Aristotle, people rediscovering the ancient knowledge. This revival of interest in classical learning was directly connected to the plague's aftermath. With so many scholars and clergy dead, ancient manuscripts were redistributed, often finding their way into new hands. Simultaneously, the questioning of medieval authorities opened minds to older sources of wisdom. Walking through Florence's streets, you notice other changes that reflect this new mindset. Public buildings commissioned by wealthy merchants rather than the church or nobility. Women visible in workshops and businesses, continuing the expanded roles they adopted out of necessity during the labor shortages. Children being taught to read and write in growing numbers, regardless of their social status. The world is opening up, observes your great-grandson as you rest on a bench near the river Arno. My friend Paolo is studying mathematics. His father was a butcher. Such social mobility would have been almost unthinkable in your childhood. The plague had broken open ossified structures, creating spaces for talent to rise regardless of birth. That evening, staying at an inn, you overhear merchants discussing political developments that further illustrate how thoroughly the post-plague world has transformed. Milan's experiment with republican government failed, but Florence's council system seems stable, one says. Venice's model is most interesting, counters another. Neither a monarchy nor truly a republic, but a system of checks and balances. These conversations about governance models reflect another change, political experimentation. With traditional authorities weakened by the plague, cities and regions had been forced to develop new approaches to governance. Some returned to older forms, but many incorporated innovations that distributed power more widely than before. Even everyday social interactions have evolved. You notice it at dinner, where merchants, craftsmen and artists sit together discussing ideas as near equals. The strict separation of social classes that marked pre-plague society has softened considerably. To Lorenzo's new banking venture, toasts one man, raising a glass to another. May it serve Florence as well as the Medici have. The rise of banking families like the Medici represents yet another post-plague development. With land no longer the sole basis of wealth and power, financial innovation had created new paths to influence. These merchant banker families often used their wealth to support arts and learning, becoming patrons of the cultural flowering now called the Renaissance. Returning home after a week in Florence, you find yourself contemplating how completely the world has changed in your lifetime. It's not just that buildings are different or new technologies have emerged, though that's true too, with advancements in printing, navigation, and military technology. The deeper change is in how people think about themselves and their place in the universe. The plague showed us our smallness, you tell your great-granddaughter one evening as she helps prepare your evening meal. How easily we could be swept away, but strangely, it also showed our greatness, how we could rebuild, reimagine, create beauty even from ashes. The girl, barely 15 but already literate and quick-minded, considers this. Is that why there's so much new art and building now? Because we faced the worst and survived? Perhaps, you nod. When half the world died, the survivors had to question everything they thought they knew. Some turned back to old certainties, but others looked forward to new possibilities. This generational perspective, your ability to compare the pre-plague world to what came after, is increasingly rare. As the 15th century progresses, fewer and fewer living people remember the world before 1347. The changes that seemed revolutionary to you have become simply the way things are for your great-grandchildren. By 1410, your body grows frailer, though your mind remains sharp. From your chair by the window, you watch the village life that continues to evolve in subtle ways. Children attend a small school established by a local merchant, another post-plague development as education expands beyond clergy and nobility. Women gather at the well, discussing not just household matters but politics and business. A group of labourers negotiate confidently with the Lord's steward over harvest terms. None of these people consciously think of themselves as living in a post-catastrophe world or a period of rebirth, yet every aspect of their lives has been shaped by the plague's long shadow and the opportunities that emerged from devastation. One spring morning in 1411, a visitor arrives, a scholar from the University at Bologna who's travelling through the region collecting stories from plague survivors. There are precious few left to interview. "I'm documenting first-hand accounts," he explains, "before they're lost forever. Future generations should know what happened, how the world changed." You invite him to sit and offer what memories you can. Some details have faded with time, but others remain vivid. The eerie silence of abandoned villages, the desperate attempts at protection with herbs and prayers, the shocking social reversals as labourers suddenly gained leverage. "The most important change," you tell him after hours of conversation, "wasn't visible. It was in how people thought about authority, about what's possible, about their own worth." The scholar nods, writing rapidly. "That matches what others have told me. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed certainties. And from their grave grew new ideas," you add. After the scholar leaves, promising to send word when his compilation is complete, though you doubt you'll live to see it, you reflect on this strange role you've acquired, a human bridge between world ages, a keeper of memories that would otherwise vanish completely. That summer brings news that would have shocked your younger self. The son of a former serf from a neighbouring village has been appointed to a university faculty. Such a leap across social boundaries would have been nearly impossible before the plague reshuffled society's deck. Similar stories abound throughout Europe. The rigid feudal structure hasn't disappeared entirely. Nobility still exists, wealth still concentrates, power still corrupts, but the system has become more permeable, with talent and initiative increasingly able to overcome accidents of birth. The stories you hear from travellers suggest similar patterns across Europe, though with regional variations. In England, the formal end of serfdom approaches. In Italy, city-states flourish under innovative governance models. In Germany, technological innovation accelerates, particularly in Gutenberg's development of movable type printing, which will soon revolutionise knowledge dissemination. This isn't to say the post-plague world is some utopia. New problems have emerged alongside new possibilities. The warfare between England and France has intensified. Religious controversies simmer. Economic inequality persists, albeit in different forms. The plague returns periodically, though never again with the devastating force of the Black Death. Yet the trajectory seems clear. The medieval world, with its rigid hierarchies and unquestioned traditions, has given way to something more dynamic, more open to change and possibility. By the winter of 1412, you sense your own end approaching. Your family gathers close. 3 generations descended from you and Agnes, who passed 5 years earlier. "Tell us one last time," asks your youngest great-grandchild, "about the world before the sickness came." You smile weakly. "It was a different world, child. Narrower in some ways, but also more certain. People rarely questioned their place or purpose. The church explained everything from the movements of stars to the fates of souls. Lords ruled, peasants obeyed, and few imagined alternatives." And after, prompts an older grandchild. After, you pause, gathering your thoughts. After, nothing could be taken for granted. If half of humanity could vanish in a few years, what other impossibilities might prove possible? If a peasant could demand wages like a craftsman, what other social rules might bend? If prayers and penances couldn't stop the pestilence, what other authorities might be questioned? You cough and someone offers water. After drinking, you continue. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed a world view, and from that death came rebirth. The word hangs in the air. Rebirth, or in Italian, rinascita. Later generations would call it the Renaissance, recognizing that something profound had shifted in European consciousness following the plague years. As winter deepens, you feel yourself growing weaker. Your family keeps vigil, a luxury many plague victims never had. In lucid moments, you share final observations and advice, attempting to distill a lifetime spanning two worlds into wisdom your descendants can carry forward. The plague taught us life's fragility, you tell them, but also its preciousness. It showed us authorities can fail, but communities can endure. It revealed our vulnerability to forces beyond control, but also our capacity to rebuild and reimagine. On a cold February morning in 1413, you slip away peacefully, a gentle end contrasting sharply with the chaotic horror of plague deaths you witnessed decades earlier. Your family mourns, but also celebrates a life that spanned humanity's darkest hours and the dawn that followed. They bury you with both Christian rites and some of the newer humanist elements that have emerged, readings from classical philosophers alongside biblical passages acknowledging both spiritual and earthly wisdom. Your grave marker bears a simple epitaph, witness to ending, witness to beginning. In the decades that follow your passing, the Renaissance accelerates. Brunelleschi completes his revolutionary dome in Florence. Gutenberg perfects his printing press, democratizing knowledge as never before. Columbus sails west, expanding European horizons literally and figuratively. Artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo create works that celebrate human potential alongside divine glory. None of these developments erase the trauma of the Black Death. Indeed, many directly emerge from it, from the questions it forced, the spaces it cleared, the certainties it shattered. The plague demonstrated humanity's fragility, but also its resilience, its mortality, but also its creativity. And so the plague's legacy proves paradoxical. From history's greatest catastrophe emerged some of its greatest flowerings. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the gradual disintegration of feudalism, the rise of more democratic governance models. Today, as you lie comfortably in your modern bed with its hygienic materials and precisely engineered support, you exist in a world shaped by these transformations. The journey from medieval catastrophe to modern comfort passed through centuries of questioning, experimentation, and reimagining what human society could be. The Black Death reminds us that history's darkest moments sometimes contain seeds of renewal, not because suffering is necessary for progress, it isn't, but because catastrophe can clear space for previously unimaginable possibilities, can force reconsideration of assumptions so deeply held they were invisible until challenged. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps there's comfort in this cyclical pattern of human experience, that endings contain beginnings, that devastation can precede renewal, that the story never truly concludes but continues evolving across generations. And in that continuous unfolding, may you find peaceful rest, knowing that you too are part of history's long and winding tale.